can you tell us a bit about yourself and why you wanted to come to this seminar?
I'm Francesca Zanatta. I'm a lecturer of children's rights and in the Early Childhood Studies department at the University of East London. And I'm also completing my PhD here at UCL in medical anthropology. I decided to come to the event to have an opportunity to explore children's rights within a different framework. I guess in the department, when we teach students about children's rights, we tend to have a very practical aspect of our teaching. So how does it relate to their work and their practice as children practitioners? And I thought that this particular environment would have been a fantastic opportunity to explore more with regards to theory, framework. I was just having a conversation with a colleague about philosophy. So really having that amazing opportunity that you usually get at conferences, where you get to understand a bit of other words related to the subject that you're interested in. But in this case, it was just about children's rights and feminism, so it really resonated with what I do in my daily work.
I'm interested about the dichotomy that you're sort of making between practical aspect and theoretical, and I was wondering how, in my head anyway, you know, theory really helps understand, lift up from practice and help understand, comes back to practice and helps understand what's really happening in reality. So I was wondering why in your work you sort of separate the two.
Okay, I don't really separate it. I possibly presented it in a slightly different way. I think theory is definitely the underpinning framework in which we teach the practical side. So for example, the first part of my module is very much an exercise of deconstructing the concept of childhood, and therefore using theory to try and understand the presence of children's rights and how to promote children's rights. However, because we are working with practitioners, and I've experienced this also whilst working for Bernardo's and other children's charities, there is a tendency to have a theoretical framework that is very much linked to its practical use. So when I say that in this kind of environment we could have broader sort of theoretical thinking, I'm discussing about, for example, the first paper that was presented today on really exploring how to embrace philosophy and sociological understanding to dig into the meaning of childhood and feminism and their correlation. So I guess I would possibly create a sort of continuum in which you have very abstract theoretical thinking, and then there will be an in-between in which theory and practice encounter and enmeshed together, and then you have the practical output of it. So these kind of opportunity, I think, allow you to really swing between the 3 points.
So you mentioned how childhood was constructed, and you also mentioned that first paper about generational order, generational structure, which Helena actually defined as post-constructionist. I can't say it, but
yeah,
you know. So can you tell me how you sort of reconcile the two? Because she's actually saying, let's move beyond this idea of construction.
So prior to moving beyond the idea of construction, you have to deconstruct. So when you work with students as a lecturer, the first point that you have to kind of cover is the deconstruction of the idea of childhood, and really trying to explore the different ways of deconstructing. I think semantic really come into play when you discuss these concepts. and you can deconstruct the idea of childhood by adopting post-constructivist theories, and what she was discussing about the critical realism. It is very interesting in terms of the use of categories such as generation or age to be correlated to the idea of gender in gender studies and feminism. So I guess it really depends in terms of the framework in which you're working. It all helps, definitely, and I was having a conversation with a colleague who's presenting a paper tomorrow based on a book that was published in the 70s, a feminist book published in the 70s, that is really becoming something completely different in the hands of a colleague who was exploring children's rights through this book and trying to, rather than deconstruct or reconstruct childhood, to rethink the relations. And that's something incredibly interesting that has come out of today's discussion as well, in terms of relations and how maybe if we move towards a situation in which we allow children to be at the same level as adults in discourse and practice, we understand the relations and we understand the interdependency between the two realities, and we can move forward rather than having to deconstruct the idea of childhood. We understand it in a different way.
And so, just to carry on, with this idea, you mentioned this as one of the key issues that have emerged for you from this conversation. What other issues or points, or do you have any questions arising from?
I think I was incredibly fascinated by the broad variety of topics that was brought to the table, because we moved from a very interesting attempts to create a theoretical framework to understand children's rights and feminism and their correlation or antagonism. And then we had more practical case studies, in a way, if you want to see it that way. So the example of the Nigerian house helpers was fascinating in the sense of exploring different realities and how children's rights and feminism are embedded in different realities and understood in different realities. I think the conversations that took place as well and originated from the different presentations, so the discussion around child labour and child sexuality, were incredibly interesting and are all very relevant and contemporary topics that we are faced to discuss on a daily basis, both as academics and practitioners. So I think it was a very intense day, and when I say intense, I mean that it was incredibly rich, and I couldn't stop taking notes and thinking about other possible research that I could develop in the future to really make use of this conversation that we had. And hopefully what will come out of tomorrow, at the end of tomorrow, will be maybe a network or something for this dialogue to continue, because I'm aware there are lots of different networks, but again, I think in this kind of environment we've enabled the creation of a very unique discourse that embraces those 3 points of abstract theory, practice and practice. So it will be incredible and very useful, I think, for moving forward as a sort of a group or a network.
So holding that thought about children's rights in context, I was wondering how, so that's a question that I've been asking myself, listening to people talking about child domestic helpers, or the other case, about the issue of consent, or
in India,
transgender children, or I was wondering, in this case, how do you think children's rights really work? How is it not? Doesn't it seem a bit as if it was an empty notion?
It's very complex.
How would they claim their rights, in a sense, from that position, from that really low position?
I think I'm going to have to give you an example. So when recently there was the Irish referendum with regards to gay rights to marriage, a point that was made was around the fact that it was preposterous and ridiculous that we even had to think about it, because human rights should embrace human beings, and therefore the concept of children's rights falls within the category of human rights in general. So we are in a position of having to discuss about children's rights because children are so marginalized and so deprived of a status or a capacity for agency or to be active agents in society in any form or shape. How does it translate to practice and to real life? I think having worked for voluntary organizations directly with children, particularly with regards to children's rights and participation, there are various forms and ways in which these agenda can be taken forward. I think the first step will be really creating a space for dialogue with children. And I recently took part in an event in South Bank. It was called Why, and it was basically exploring what's the status of children's rights in the UK and how to improve it. And there were 5 events on what makes a good childhood, and children practitioners were invited to address this question. But no children were contacted or allowed to participate. And the way the events were pitched, you had the children's events, and then you had these events, which is, what's a good childhood? Why not asking children? So I think the first step will be bringing children to the table and have this kind of conversation, honest conversation with them. Again, I'm very looking forward to a paper from a colleague tomorrow, the one that I was mentioning, I can't remember the name now. And it's about Firestone's book, this feminist book. And we were just discussing how the colleague approaches the relations and the communications and dynamics with children and human beings in general from a point of sharing rather than having a power relation or some kind of hierarchy. So having a horizontal approach to relating children, women, any sort of human being.
I totally understand that. I wouldn't say my issue, but what I've been wondering in terms of children's rights is, so it has to come, who will convene these discussions, who will start these discussions? It comes from an adult. It usually comes from adults. So that means that you've already recognized that children don't have the power.
It would come from an adult if we are promoting this sort of event from within the framework that we have at the moment. But a next step, actually, maybe the first step should have been information and changing the dynamics up before having the dialogues. So changing the education system and what children are allowed to know, what children are allowed to participate in, create a sort of space in which children develop as active agents from birth.
Thank you, Francesca.
No.